See your hand in front of your face. Specialist David Chen, driving an M2 Bradley fighting vehicle with the 1st Infantry Division, can see everything. Through his ANVIS-2 thermal viewer, the desert ahead glows with heat signatures, Iraqi vehicles, bunkers, individual soldiers moving in defensive positions. None of them know American forces are already positioned for engagement. Chen's Bradley is one of hundreds of U.S. combat vehicles advancing through what should be impenetrable darkness, preparing to launch the ground offensive that will liberate Kuwait. Iraqi defenders in those positions ahead are scanning the darkness, listening for engine sounds, watching for any sign of approaching forces. They see nothing. They won't see anything until American ordnance begins impacting their positions from ranges where they can't respond. The 100-hour ground war is about to begin, and Iraqi forces are already at a disadvantage they can't overcome. They're fighting an enemy who owns the night. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Iraqi defensive doctrine, learned from Soviet advisors and Soviet military theory, held that night operations were inherently difficult and dangerous. Attacking at night meant moving through unfamiliar terrain without clear visibility, risking navigation errors, friendly fire incidents, and command confusion. Defending at night meant holding prepared positions with known fields of fire, able to engage attackers who revealed themselves with movement and weapons discharge. Iraqi commanders had positioned their forces accordingly, expecting that major American attacks would come during daylight when U.S. technological advantages could be most effectively employed. They understood American forces possessed superior equipment, but they also understood that darkness limited everyone's capabilities. Night was the great equalizer. Except it wasn't. To understand Iraqi confidence in night defensive operations, you need to understand what they were equipped with and what Soviet doctrine taught them. Iraqi forces deployed with Soviet-supplied night vision devices, primarily the 1PN51 and 1PN58 models developed in the 1980s. These devices used first-generation image intensification technology combined with active infrared illumination. The system worked by projecting an infrared beam, invisible to the naked eye, that reflected off targets and returned to the device's receiver, creating a visible image. Under ideal conditions, Soviet night vision devices provided effective observation to approximately 150 to 200 meters. The systems were heavy, weighing over 1 kilogram for handheld devices, and battery life typically lasted 4 to 6 hours of continuous operation. Iraqi forces didn't have enough of these devices to equip every soldier. They were typically issued to specialized units, vehicle commanders, and defensive position leaders. Soviet doctrine acknowledged that these capabilities were sufficient for defensive operations. Defenders holding prepared positions didn't need to see long distances. They needed to observe their immediate perimeter and engage attackers at close range. The active infrared illuminators required for Soviet systems did create a vulnerability, since opposing forces equipped with night vision could detect the infrared beam. But Soviet planners assumed both sides would have similar capability limitations. Iraqi officers, trained in this doctrine, deployed their forces with confidence that night defensive positions would be secure against anything except the most careful and limited attacks. What Iraqi forces didn't know was that American night vision technology had advanced far beyond Soviet capabilities, creating a gap that would prove decisive. The United States had invested heavily in night vision development throughout the 1970s and 1980s, recognizing that the ability to conduct 24-hour operations would provide enormous tactical advantages. The AN PVS-5 night vision goggle entered service in the mid-1970s, providing U.S. soldiers with Generation 2 image intensification that didn't require active illumination. The system was passive, amplifying existing ambient light from stars, moon, or even distant artificial light sources to create a visible image without revealing the observer's position. Effective range exceeded 300 meters under most conditions, but the PVS-5 was just the beginning. In 1982, the AN PVS-7 series night vision device began replacing earlier systems across U.S. military forces. The PVS-7 employed Generation 2+ image intensification technology that amplified available light approximately 30,000 times, providing clear visibility in conditions that appeared completely dark to the unaided eye. The device weighed less than 0.7 kilograms, could be mounted on a standard infantry helmet, and operated for more than 20 hours on a single AA battery. Unlike Soviet systems requiring active infrared, the PVS-7 operated passively and undetectably. Enemy forces had no way to know they were being observed. The system's effective range extended beyond 300 meters, and under favorable conditions with some ambient light, soldiers could observe and identify targets at 400 to 500 meters in what appeared to be complete darkness. By 1991, the U.S. military had fielded enough PVS-7 devices to equip virtually every frontline combat unit. Infantry squads operated with multiple soldiers carrying night vision, allowing them to maneuver in darkness as effectively as during daylight. But individual night vision was only part of American technological advantage. Vehicle-mounted systems provided even more dramatic capabilities. The M1 Abrams tank employed the AN-VSG-2 tank thermal sight. a second-generation forward-looking infrared system that detected heat signatures rather than amplifying light. Thermal imaging doesn't depend on any light source. It creates images from the infrared radiation emitted by objects based on their temperature. The advantage for military operations is revolutionary. Thermal systems see through conditions that defeat traditional night vision. Smoke, dust storms, fog, even camouflage nets that block visible light but allow thermal radiation to pass through. The M1's thermal sight provided effective detection ranges exceeding 3,000 meters for vehicle-sized targets, allowing tank crews to identify and engage enemy armor at distances where Iraqi forces couldn't even detect American presence. The M2 Bradley fighting vehicle carried the ANTAS-4 thermal sight with similar capability. The vehicle's gunner could scan the battlefield in complete darkness, identifying enemy positions, vehicles, and personnel through thermal signatures, while the Bradley remained invisible to enemy observation. Attack helicopters received FLIR, forward-looking infrared, systems like the AN/AAQ-11, giving Apache pilots the ability to navigate and engage targets in conditions of zero visibility. Every significant combat vehicle in the U.S. inventory by 1991 included some form of thermal imaging, creating a force that operated effectively 24 hours per day, regardless of lighting conditions. Iraqi forces had no equivalent capability. Soviet armor employed infrared searchlights, active systems that projected infrared beams to illuminate targets, similar in concept to the handheld devices, but scaled up for vehicle use. These systems had effective ranges of 800 to 1,000 meters under ideal conditions, but they suffered the same fundamental flaw as the handheld units. The infrared beam was visible to any opponent with night vision equipment. An Iraqi tank using its infrared searchlight to scan for targets was broadcasting its exact position to every American vehicle and aircraft within line of sight. Iraqi thermal imaging capability was essentially non-existent. Soviet development programs for thermal sights existed, but hadn't produced systems ready for field deployment in numbers sufficient to equip Iraqi forces. When coalition forces launched their ground offensive at 0400 hours on February 24, 1991, Iraqi defenders faced a technological disadvantage they couldn't overcome and did not fully understand until it was too late. American forces advanced through complete darkness with clear visibility. Infantry moved confidently through terrain Iraqi defenders could barely see. Combat vehicles maneuvered into engagement positions that should have been impossible to reach in darkness. And then the engagement began from ranges where Iraqi forces couldn't respond. Staff Sergeant Anthony Morse, commanding an M1 Abrams tank with the 3rd Armored Division, later described the experience. "We were advancing through what looked like a clear green landscape. My thermal sight showed Iraqi positions as bright spots against the cooler desert. They had no idea we were there. We engaged the first T-72 from 2,500 meters. My gunner put a sabot round through it before they even knew we'd arrived. We engaged and disabled 3 more Iraqi tanks from that position. None of them returned fire. I don't think they ever saw us." This pattern repeated across the entire front. American armor engaged Iraqi forces from beyond the range where Iraqi systems could detect them, firing from positions Iraqi defenders couldn't identify, maneuvering to new locations, while Iraqi crews desperately searched for targets they never found. The thermal imaging advantage was so complete that some U.S. tank crews engaged multiple Iraqi vehicles before anyone in the Iraqi formation even understood they were under fire. Iraqi tanks would explode or be disabled by impacts they couldn't trace to a source. Iraqi crews who survived these engagements and were captured later described the experience as being engaged by invisible forces, fighting an enemy they never located. That breaks morale faster than almost any other combat condition. Iraqi units that remained in defensive positions through the first night of ground operations often surrendered the following morning, rather than face another night of being engaged by forces they couldn't detect. Iraqi commanders lost control of their units as soldiers abandoned positions and fled from what seemed like ghost forces attacking from the darkness. Coalition air operations exploited the same technological advantage. Apache helicopter crews with FLIR systems conducted hunter-killer missions deep into Iraqi territory during darkness, identifying and engaging Iraqi armor, artillery, and air defense systems while operating at altitudes and ranges where Iraqi forces couldn't detect them. The attacks came without warning. Iraqi crews would see their vehicles explode from impacts they never anticipated. By the time surviving forces heard the sound of rotor blades, the helicopters had already departed. Iraqi air defense operators couldn't engage targets they couldn't see, and their radar systems designed primarily to detect high-altitude aircraft struggled to track low-flying helicopters maneuvering in ground clutter. The operational tempo advantage proved equally important. U.S. forces conducted 80% of their ground combat operations during nighttime hours. This wasn't just a tactical preference. It was a strategic decision based on technological capability. American forces could plan and execute complex maneuvers in complete darkness, maintaining coordination through radio communication and navigation systems while observing battlefield conditions through night vision and thermal imaging. Iraqi forces essentially ceased combat operations when darkness fell, unable to maneuver effectively, unable to coordinate actions, unable to maintain situational awareness. Every night, Iraqi forces hunkered down in defensive positions and hoped they wouldn't be attacked. Every night, American forces conducted offensive operations, repositioning forces, engaging Iraqi units, and advancing toward objectives. The 24-hour operational capability meant U.S. forces effectively had twice as much productive combat time as their opponents. The technology gap extended beyond just night vision devices. American forces employed GPS navigation systems that allowed precise movement in darkness across featureless desert terrain. Iraqi forces relied on map and compass navigation, extremely difficult in darkness without clear terrain features. American forces used infrared chemical lights, visible through night vision but invisible to the naked eye, to mark positions, vehicle locations, and navigation waypoints, allowing units to maintain formation and orientation in complete darkness. Iraqi forces couldn't mark positions without revealing them to enemy observation. American forces communicated with secure radio systems that allowed complex coordination. Iraqi forces discovered their radio communications were being intercepted and jammed, forcing them to rely on messengers and visual signals that darkness made impossible. The cumulative effect created a situation where American forces operated in one reality while Iraqi forces operated in another. American soldiers saw a clear battlefield, maintained constant communication, navigated precisely, and engaged targets at extended ranges. Iraqi forces operated essentially blind, with limited communication, uncertain navigation, and no ability to engage opponents they couldn't locate. It wasn't just a technological advantage. It was a fundamental difference in combat effectiveness. Major Khalid al-Rahman, commanding an Iraqi Republican Guard mechanized company defending positions in southern Kuwait, surrendered to American forces on February 26 after 2 nights of continuous contact. In his debriefing, he described what his forces experienced. "We prepared positions we thought were strong. We had clear fields of fire, good defensive positions, infantry support. Then the Americans came at night. We heard engines, we heard movement, but we saw nothing. Our infrared equipment showed nothing at ranges where we could engage. Then our vehicles started exploding. We fired at muzzle flashes, at sounds, at nothing. We hit nothing. Our vehicles kept exploding from directions we couldn't identify. By morning, half my company was gone and we never saw the enemy. The second night was worse. My soldiers were terrified. They said we were fighting jinn, ghosts. When American infantry appeared the next morning, we surrendered immediately. We couldn't fight an enemy we couldn't see." This testimony appeared in debriefs from dozens of Iraqi officers and soldiers across multiple units. The consistent theme was complete inability to engage American forces effectively during nighttime operations, leading to rapid demoralization and collapse of defensive positions. Some Iraqi units suffered 60 to 70% equipment losses during nighttime engagements without ever identifying American positions clearly enough to coordinate effective return fire. The technology gap reflected fundamentally different approaches to military modernization. The United States had invested heavily in electronics, sensors, and information systems throughout the 1970s and 1980s, recognizing that advantages in detection and targeting would prove decisive in modern combat. Soviet military development focused more on platform performance, building tanks with heavier armor and bigger guns, aircraft with higher performance, artillery with longer range. Both approaches had merit, but when they collided in desert conditions, ideal for long-range detection and engagement, the advantage went decisively to forces with superior sensors. An Iraqi T-72 tank matched or exceeded M1 Abrams performance in some specifications, but when the T-72 crew couldn't see the Abrams crew engaging them from 2,500 meters away, those performance specifications became irrelevant. The legacy of Desert Storm night operations transformed military procurement priorities worldwide. Countries that had dismissed night vision as specialized equipment for elite units suddenly recognized it as fundamental combat capability. By 2000, most NATO militaries had fielded night vision devices to standard infantry units. Development focus shifted to Generation 3 and Generation 3 Plus image intensification systems with improved range, resolution, and reliability. Thermal imaging systems became standard equipment on all combat vehicles, and costs dropped as manufacturing volume increased and technology matured. Modern American infantry forces operate with every soldier equipped with night vision capability. The current ANPVS-14 monocular night vision device provides Generation 3 Plus performance with effective ranges exceeding 500 meters and operational endurance of 20 plus hours. Soldiers trained to operate in complete darkness as routinely as in daylight, conducting complex tactical maneuvers, room clearances, and target engagements in conditions where previous generations of military forces would have been effectively immobilized. Special Operations Forces employ even more advanced systems, including fused night vision and thermal imaging devices that combine both technologies into a single display, providing optimal detection capability under any conditions. The 24-hour operational capability pioneered in Desert Storm has become standard expectation for American military forces. Operations in Afghanistan and Iraq throughout the 2000s and 2010s heavily emphasized nighttime missions precisely because U.S. forces maintained overwhelming advantage in those conditions. The majority of raids, direct action missions, and offensive operations occurred during darkness when American technological superiority created maximum tactical advantage. Enemy forces learned that darkness didn't provide safety. It simply meant American forces would attack when opponents were most vulnerable. Iraqi forces in 1991 believed that night defensive positions would provide security. Soviet doctrine taught them that darkness favored defenders holding prepared ground. Their equipment reinforced this belief. Systems designed for close-range defensive observation seemed adequate for the mission. What they didn't understand was that American technology had moved beyond incremental improvements to fundamental revolution in night combat capability. The gap wasn't a difference in device quality. It was the difference between forces that could see and forces that were blind, between military organizations that could operate 24 hours per day and those that effectively ceased operations when the sun set. The 100-hour ground war of Desert Storm occurred primarily at night, not because darkness provided concealment for American forces, but because darkness provided decisive advantage. Iraqi forces fought a war of daylight, planning operations for visibility, organizing defenses around what they could see and engage during the day. American forces owned the night, operating with full visibility in conditions where their opponents were blind, maintaining 24-hour offensive tempo, while enemy forces hunkered down hoping to survive until morning. When those philosophies met in combat, the side that owned the darkness owned the battlefield. Iraq fought the war of daylight. America owned the night.